Well, good evening, everybody. It's 6 o'clock, so let's get started. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us tonight and welcome you to the Little Cottonwood Canyon EIS Draft Alternatives public meeting. I'd like to start with some quick introductions from myself and the team, and then Dave will help us out with this meeting overview, and then we'll get into the presentation and then on to the questions and answers. So I'm Josh Van Jura. I'm UDOT's project manager.
Vince Izzo. I am part of the team preparing the EIS for UDOT.
This is Lance Koval. I'm the acting district ranger for the Salt Lake Ranger District on the Wasatch Cache National Forest.
Hi, I'm Autumn Hugh. I'm UTA NEPA project administrator.
Hi, my name is Bree Binabus, and I'm part of the communications and public involvement team.
Hi, and I'm Dave Smith, and I'm also part of the study team with the communications team, and also have been asked to help moderate this meeting tonight. So again, as Josh said, welcome to all of you who are able to participate with us tonight in this virtual public meeting. And I'll just walk through just how this is set up for tonight and how things are going to progress. The format of the meeting is presentation style, where those of us on the project team will walk all of you who are participating through the information, and then we'll take questions at the end of the presentation. The meeting and the chat in the chat function will be recorded as part of the project record and will be available to view on the project website when we upload that later. Only the presenters and those answering the questions will be speaking and sharing a screen. So we encourage you who are participating to turn off your video since you don't need it to just preserve bandwidth. But please feel free to use the chat function, and we'll explain that, how we're going to use that in just a minute. We ask that everyone that's participating tonight to respect the group, all the participants as well as the presenters. Questions or comments that include foul language, obscenities, or threats will be deleted at our discretion, and those individuals will also be removed from the meeting. You will be able to submit questions in the chat box throughout the meeting. We'll answer as many questions as possible after we get through the presentation, and they'll be answered in the order that we receive them in the chat. So if you have questions as we go along, please feel free to put those into the chat at any time, and we'll begin to answer those once we wrap up the presentation. We'll start with the chat, and if we get through all the questions in the chat, we'll move to the Facebook Live group and start to answer those questions as time permits. We did do this last night and weren't able to get through all the questions, but we will capture all questions and put together an FAQ that will be posted to the project website with all the questions and answers. So don't worry if we don't get to your question, we will address it as we are collecting all of those, and we'll put it on the website. All the questions and comments made in this virtual meeting are very helpful, and we encourage your participation tonight. But we want to clarify that they are not considered formal comments as part of the NEPA process. We ask that you submit formal comments through the official channels that are all explained on the project website, which we'll put a link in the chat to the project website. And there you can see that the official channels for comments are through the website itself. There's a comment form. Through email, there's an email listed on the website. Through voicemail, there's a phone number there. And through a mailed letter where we have an address. Those are the official ways to submit comments. And we encourage you, any comments that you leave with us tonight in the chat, to also take the time to put those in as formal comments through those 4 methods. Again, look to the chat for the website address, and those are outlined on the website. In addition, as part of the NEPA process, we are required to keep an attendance of who attended our both virtual and any other meetings that we hold, so that we can show that we have tried to comply with all public meeting efforts, as well as they were non-discriminatory in nature. So we are including a chat to a Google Doc where we'd ask you throughout this meeting to click on that link and just register for the meeting so that we have that record. And again, that will be in the chat. Before we start with the presentation, if you have any issues with seeing the presentation, if we either go too fast or they're not, or the numbers and information is not clear, please do not worry. All the graphics that we're using, all the information that we're sharing in the presentation is currently on the website. And you can find all the information there. We've tried to summarize it in the presentation to give you a high level overview, but we encourage you to spend time on the website with the actual draft alternatives information to dive deeper into the details as you see fit. We'll also be posting presentation on the website as well. So all information is there. With that, Josh, we'll turn it over to you to present. When Josh is done, I will then come back on and we will start going through all the questions.
Well, thank you, Dave. I appreciate that introduction. And I want to say thank you again to everybody that took time out of their day today to join us for this presentation of the 3 reasonable alternatives that UDOT is proposing to move forward into the draft EIS for SR 210. A little bit of background. Over the past 30 years, there have been many studies that have been conducted in and for the Cottonwood Canyons. And these past studies were critical in identifying both problems and concerns and suggesting transportation solutions. The one thing that these past studies agreed upon was the recommendation that further detailed analysis was necessary. And that's exactly what the EIS is doing. It's that further detailed analysis and evaluation. So on the slide, you can see our study area, SR 210, from the mouth of Big Cottonwood and Fort Union, along Wasatch Boulevard, then north Little Cottonwood Road, and finally up through the town of Alta. And I think most of you are familiar with the problems that both Wasatch Boulevard and the canyon face today. With the growth that Utah is projecting for the future, it's easy to see how these problems are only going to magnify. Our no-build estimates for 2050, which is our planning horizon, show that travel time in the canyon is regularly going to reach 80 to 85 minutes. And that's simply too long to get out and get into the canyon. So that takes us to the purpose of the project. The purpose of the project is to substantially improve safety, reliability, and mobility on 210 from Fort Union through the town of Alta. And the mobility on SR 210 and the canyon proper is easy to see on any busy ski day. Wasatch Boulevard mobility is a little bit different problem, and that's really, it's a weekday commuter traffic problem. So I want to make sure everybody understands those 2 separate mobility problems that we're experiencing on SR 210. The second part of that project purpose is reliability. And reliability, as UDOT defines it, is the degree of certainty or predictability in travel times. So this is saying if it normally takes you 30 minutes to get to your favorite trailhead or to Snowbird, that you should expect that it will take 30 minutes for you to get to that regular destination. And avalanche closures are a big factor in the reduced reliability in the canyon. The third component of that project purpose is safety. And safety is always one of UDOT's goals. And here that not only relates to the avalanche risk, but also to the roadside parking in Little Cottonwood. And we'll get into more of those details as we get further into the presentation. So the first phase of the environmental process is the scoping phase. And last April, 2019, UDOT had a public comment period as part of that scoping phase and wanted to hear from the residents, the users, local businesses, what their perception of the problems in the canyon were, and what are some of the potential solutions to those problems. And the other thing we did, of course, is reference those studies, the numerous studies that had been in the past, to see what they were defining as the problems and what their solutions were, so we could learn from all that previous work that had been done also. So after that process, we started with 105 initial concepts, and we've screened them down to 3 primary alternatives that meet that purpose and need. And it's those 3 primary alternatives that we're going to spend the majority of the time on today. Now, if you want more details on that screening process, that's all in the screening report. I suggest you go read through that if you have time. There's a ton of great information in there, and we're really trying to boil it down to just the highest level and leave the most amount of time for your questions. The other part of the 3 primary alternatives is that in each of those primary alternatives, there's 5 sub-elements that are common to each of those 3 alternatives. And we'll talk about those after the alternatives. So the 3 reasonable alternatives are an enhanced bus with peak period shoulder lanes, and a gondola. And we'll talk about each of these individually. So let's start with the enhanced bus. In this alternative, you'll notice that there's no roadway widening from North Little Cottonwood Road up through the town of Alta. One of those common subcomponents that we talked about would be a mobility hub, both at the gravel pit and at the existing UTA park and ride at 94 South and Highland. And another common component would be roadway widening on Wasatch, including bus priority. So let's talk about the actual bus service that's proposed in this alternative. This alternative involves running 24 buses per hour, and those 24 buses would be evenly divided between the 2 mobility hubs. So that results in 12 buses per hour coming or departing from each hub. So that means essentially a bus would leave the mobility hub every 5 minutes. And conveniently, 5 minutes is approximately the time it takes to load and unload 42 people onto a ski bus. The other part of this I want to make sure everybody's aware of is that this would be direct to service. So you would leave the mobility hub and travel directly to Snowbird or directly to Alta. You wouldn't stop at additional bus stops along Wasatch. There's no trailhead stops. And the Snowbird bus would not continue on to Alta, nor would the Alta bus stop at Snowbird first. And this direct to service is really needed for the efficiency of the bus service and to reduce the overall travel time for the transit users in this alternative. So we'll talk about travel time and costs in a summary slide here, because I think they're easier to see when they're compared next to each other. So let's move on to the second alternative. And that's enhanced bus service with peak period shoulder lanes. So you'll notice this option has the same 2 mobility hubs. It also includes roadway widening Wasatch Boulevard with the bus priority. However, the difference here is that it would include roadway widening from North Little Cotton, once it becomes North Little Cottonwood Road, essentially at the Lokai Light up through the bypass road. And this widening would include an 11-foot shoulder, both in the uphill and downhill travel direction. And this is where the buses could run during those peak times, and they could actually pass passenger vehicles and reduce that travel time even farther. The one additional benefit I'd like to mention about the enhanced bus service, and while this isn't a goal of the project, I think it's important to note that additional widening would increase safety not only for motorists, but also for cyclists and pedestrians in the canyon. And under this option, it's the same 24 buses per hour. So a bus leaving each hub every 5 minutes with direct to service. So the only real difference in alternative 2 compared to the first one is really that roadway widening to reduce the travel time for the transit users. So let's look at the third option now, the gondola. You'll notice that this includes a single mobility hub at the gravel pit. It also includes the same roadway widening with bus priority on Wasatch. And you can see that the base station for the gondola would be located at the existing Little Cottonwood Park and Ride. And I think this is important to point out that users of the gondola would need to park at the mobility hub and board a bus to the base of the gondola, at which time they could travel up to Snowbird or Alta. There's no mid-canyon stops associated with the gondola, so same direct to service. And this is a 3S gondola, so larger than many of the gondolas you may be familiar with. Each cabin on this gondola would hold approximately 35 people. And we're estimating that these would arrive every 2 minutes. So let's go into the summary of the 3 alternatives so we can talk about travel time and costs, and you can see everything on the screen relative to each other. So that very first column on the left, or second column, sorry, is the proposed transit concept travel time. And travel time is a very important factor for any solution, right? I think you may remember I mentioned that under a no-build situation in 2050, we're expecting average canyon travel times to be 80 to 85 minutes. So either of these 3 options presents significant benefit in the proposed transit travel time. So if you look at that first option, the enhanced bus option, the proposed transit concept travel time, we've been calling it seat time. This is the time that an individual would be sitting on the bus, or the total trip time, sorry, not sitting on the bus, the total trip time to get to Alta. So in this situation, the transit user riding the bus, it would take 54 minutes from the mobility hub up through Alta. And I think it's important to note that if we're taking this many users out of their cars and putting them on buses, that's going to improve the car travel time also in each of these alternatives. So while the bus user would experience 54-minute transit time, a private vehicle would experience 42 minutes under this situation. Under the enhanced bus with peak period shoulders option, that proposed transit time or seat time would be reduced to 36 minutes. And this is actually the only one of the 3 options where the transit time is actually faster than taking your car. In this case, a car would take 38 minutes. And that's predominantly due to the time or the availability for the bus to use that peak period shoulder lane and pass cars that are stuck in the traffic. The third option for the gondola has a proposed seat time of 63 minutes and a car travel time of 38 minutes. And that additional time represents the time that it takes to go into the mobility hub, park, walk to the bus stop, wait up to 5 minutes for a bus, in which time you would then travel to the base station, unload from the bus, again, wait up to 2 minutes for a cabin to arrive, and then travel up to Snowbird or Alta. I think it's important to note that the max speed of a 3S gondola is limited to approximately 17 or 18 miles an hour, which is much less than the posted speed limit in the canyon. So I just want to make sure everybody's aware of that, kind of why that has a different travel time. The other thing I wanted to talk about on this slide is the relative cost of each of these alternatives. The enhanced bus with no widening has a capital cost of $283 million, with $9 million a year in operation and maintenance costs. The enhanced bus with peak period shoulder lanes has a capital cost of $470 million, with $6.2 million operation and maintenance costs. And the gondola kind of sits right in the middle on capital costs at $393 million and has a $4.5 million operation and maintenance cost. And I want to correct something I just said. I said those operation and maintenance costs represent yearly costs, and that is not a true statement. I apologize. Those costs represent only winter service, because the problem we're trying to solve is honestly mobility with these three alternatives, is mobility in that 30th busiest hour of the year, which is a winter time hour. So these O&M costs represent a period of time similar to the period that buses run in the canyon today. And that's roughly Thanksgiving through mid-April. So again, I just want to clarify that and make sure everybody understands this is just winter O&M costs. So that being said, we recognize that there's no current need to run a transit alternative in the summer based on mobility problems existing or predicted. But we recognize that the gondola could provide tourism opportunities to the state. And we'd like to hear the public's opinion on whether we should analyze summer gondola service or not. And if you are for summer gondola service, we'd like to know what restrictions we should consider in that analysis. So hours of operation, should it only run from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. or some other combination of hours? Should mountain bikes be allowed on the gondola is another topic that we've talked a little bit about. So again, please comment on summer gondola operation along with anything else in this presentation. This is really, again, Dave mentioned in the beginning, we really want the public's input for which of these alternatives and those components you feel that we got right in the analysis, or if there's a part you disagree with, or you feel like we missed something, please comment. So let's talk about those 5 components. And these are the subcomponents I talked about. And I mentioned them a little bit, but let's go into a little more detail on each of these 5 components. And again, these are each represented in all 3 of the primary reasonable alternatives, with the exception of snow sheds. Snow sheds only apply to the 2 bus options. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So let's talk about Wasatch Boulevard first and the widening. Again, I mentioned that widening Wasatch Boulevard would be included in all 3 of the reasonable alternatives. And again, I want to clarify, I mentioned this in the beginning, but the problem that Wasatch Boulevard experiences and will experience in that 2050 planning horizon is not just related to busy ski days, but also during the weekday PM commute. So this is really going to be a 52-week-a-year problem, not just a busy ski day problem. So UDOT evaluated 5 different alternatives to help solve this congestion problem that's anticipated or exists and is expected to grow on Wasatch. And they looked at transit only, roundabouts, reversible lanes, imbalanced lanes, and a 5-lane section. And only 2 of those alternatives met UDOT's goal of level of service D or better during that PM peak time, which is the southbound traffic. And those 2 options were the 5-lane alternative and the imbalanced lane alternative. So the 5-lane alternative is probably a pretty familiar cross-section to many of us in Utah. This is a pretty standard 5-lane arterial roadway cross-section. It includes 2 lanes northbound, 2 lanes southbound with a center turn lane. And there would also be a bike lane and shoulders, both northbound and southbound. And these bike lanes and shoulders could actually be used as part of that bus priority under any of the three alternatives. So when we talked about bus priority, it's not just signal priority, but it's also peak period shoulder lanes. And then I'd also like to point out that there's a 10-foot wide shared use path on the east side of the road also to help prevent active transportation. So the other alternative is very similar. It's called the imbalance lane alternative, and it's called that because it has 2 lanes southbound and only a single lane northbound. You'll see that it retains the bike lanes and the shoulders and that shared use path. Cost-wise on these 2 alternatives, they're very close. So mobility hubs. We talked a little bit about the mobility hubs. And just so everybody knows, a mobility hub is really just a well-engineered parking structure that allows buses and private vehicles to both enter the parking structure and leave smoothly and efficiently. And obviously, we're proposing 3 transit alternatives here. So if we want people to choose one of these transit alternatives, we need to give them a place to park their personal vehicles or a place to transfer from potentially feeder buses that are coming from different places in the valley. So all 3 of the alternatives require a mobility hub. The 2 buses you may remember had 2 mobility hubs where the Gondola had a single mobility hub. So let's talk about some of the locations that were considered for mobility hubs. So the project team analyzed 14 different mobility hub locations. And some of the constraints for these mobility hubs is, the first one is to get the number of stalls, we need 4 acres bare minimum. That would be the tightest we could fit these stalls in. The second part is it needs to be available on weekends and holidays, but also holiday periods. Think Christmas break, President's Day weekend, some of those extended periods where we expect to see peak traffic. So because of those, that ruled out schools, churches, and existing businesses. The other part is if the mobility hub isn't easy to access and easy to use, then nobody's going to use it. So ease of use was a main consideration here. And there's only 2 of those 14 alternatives that met those requirements. And those 2 locations, I think I mentioned, and that's the gravel pit that's just north of the mouth of Big Cottonwood. And the second location is the existing UTA park and ride at 94 South and Highland. So I mentioned the project goal is to increase or to solve mobility problems. And to solve those mobility problems, we estimate that we need 30% of the vehicles to move to one of these transit alternatives. So using that 30% number, which is the capacity of a mountain, we're trying to reduce it such that we stayed below the capacity threshold on a 2-lane mountainous road. And assuming average vehicle occupancy, it varies, but around numbers 2, we estimate that we need roughly 1,500 parking stalls at the gravel pit and approximately 1,000 stalls at the 9400 South and Highland location. Relative costs on those 2 are 31 million and 20 million respectively. And I want to mention that the cost to widen Wasatch, the cost of the mobility hubs, the cost of the snow sheds, all these costs are already included in those numbers that we just reviewed a couple of slides ago in that summary spreadsheet. So these are not in addition, these are already included in those costs. So the third subcomponent is the snow sheds, and snow sheds are currently only allocated for the 2 bus options and are not planned as part of the gondola option. I want to make sure everybody understands that. So when I was talking about snow sheds with some coworkers the other day, I got a very quizzical look. I want to make sure everybody understands what a snow shed is. Essentially, a snow shed puts a roof over the roadway. And this roof allows avalanche debris to flow over the roadway rather than to be deposited onto the roadway. And this not only keeps vehicles safe, but it reduces the cleanup time so we can get cars flowing again. So we're proposing snow sheds to cover 3 of the most frequent repeaters in the canyon. And if you're familiar with the canyon, those are White Pine Chutes, and Little Pine Slide Pass. So the 2 snow shed alternatives that are being considered, one is snow sheds with berms, and the second is snow sheds without berms, but we would realign the road. So the berms are approximately a 20-foot high earthen wall that would direct and kind of concentrate the avalanche debris, allowing the total length of the snow shed to be reduced. So in this situation, it would be roughly 2,500 total feet of snow shed with an estimated cost of $72 million. Now these berms would extend roughly 300 feet uphill from the roadway. And again, they're going to act like a giant funnel. But we recognize that these earthen berms would have visual impacts. So we're looking at another option, and that's snow sheds without berms, but realigning the road, essentially bringing it a little bit closer to the uphill side, which allows us to minimize the backfill required and reduce the construction costs. So in this situation without berms, the total length of the snow sheds increases by roughly 700 feet to 3,200 total feet. And that also results in an added cost of roughly 14 million, taking the cost of this option up to 86 million. So here's some cross sections of both the snow shed and the earthen berm. You can see it would support 3 lanes, and it would include a bike path outside. The other thing I think it's important to note, and this graphic doesn't really convey it, but the right-hand side, or the downhill side of the snow shed, would actually be windowed, if you will, in that it would only have columns, and you would still have sightline out that right-hand or downhill side of the snow shed. And there's a cross section of the earthen berm. You can see it's roughly 20 feet high and 10 feet wide at the top. So this is a pretty large earthen structure. So let's talk about the benefits that snow sheds bring. The bar chart on the left is the yearly closure hours due to avalanche mitigation in the canyon over the past 20 years. And that dashed line in the middle is the average, and that averages 56 hours per year over a 20-year period. Now you can see that some years are much higher and some years are much lower, but again, the average is 56 hours. The department expects that with the installation of these snow sheds, we can reduce that total closure time down to 11 hours per year, which is an 80% reduction in roadway closures for our avalanche program. And that's a huge benefit to that reliability goal that we talked about in the purpose. The second component or benefit that snow sheds bring is the reduction in the current avalanche hazard index. So currently Little Cottonwood with the artillery program has an AHI of 90. With the installation of the snow sheds, that would be reduced down to 59. So that represents a one-third savings in the hazard index. So obviously the snow sheds bring a lot of benefit both to the reliability goal by reducing the overall closures by 80% and the safety goal by reducing the hazard index by 30%. The next option, or the next common subcomponent to all 3 primary alternatives, and again, this is all 3 primary alternatives, is trailhead parking. So the three options that UDOT is looking at here are quite different, and I'll go through them, and it's a bit confusing. So if there's questions, please put them in the chat. But trailhead parking is, again, mainly a safety thing, because if we can get people off of the roadway, that decreases side friction for motorists. It gives cyclists a place to ride, and also those pedestrians, because when you get out of your car and do roadside parking, you become a pedestrian, right? To travel to whatever your trailhead is. It's safer for all of those people. So there's three different options. The first option is to eliminate all roadside parking from the canyon entrance up to Snowbird Entry 1. And under this situation, the total parking in the canyon would be reduced from 528 stalls down to 99 stalls. The second and third option involve doing some trailhead parking improvements. And these trailhead parking improvements would be at the gate buttress, the bridge, Lisa Falls, and White Pine. And I'll show a graphic of the other two here in a minute. So again, both option 2 and 3 involve these trailhead improvements. You can see that they would include both restrooms and water quality buffers. They would be paved with parking stalls to help with mobility and ease of use for these. And where these two second and third option differ is the reduction in roadside parking. So option 2 continues the no roadside parking below entry 1. So in this situation, we would build the 4 trailhead parking improvements, but eliminate all roadside parking below entry 1. And in this option, the spaces in the canyon would be reduced from 528 down to 221 spaces. And so the final option, again, it would include improved parking areas, but under this option, we would only eliminate trailhead parking within a quarter mile of the trailhead. And honestly, that's as far as most people are willing to walk to get to a trailhead. So under this situation, we would reduce the total parking below entry 1 by a mere 17 spaces. So it would go from 528 total spaces down to 511 total spaces. So the final component that's common, okay, that's not true. There's one other component. One more component that would be common to all 3 of the primary alternatives is the potential elimination of winter roadside parking above entry 1. So this is next to the resorts. Currently above entry 1, there's approximately 900 parking stalls. And we're not talking about the stalls in Snowbird's lot or up at Wildcat or Albion. What we're really talking about is those that are on-road parking. And we're proposing to eliminate 230 of those 900 spots. And again, this is not the spots that are up by the fire station or up at the mouth of Grizzly Gulch, but those spots where you actually park parallel to the white line. So in the true shoulder of the road. And while we recognize these 230 spots are a lot, we hope that by providing transit alternatives and up to 2,500 parking spaces in the valley, that more than offsets the reduction of these 230 spots. Because not only are these safety spots, but they're significant mobility and operation spots. So again, when people park in these 230 spots, they then get out of their car, get their ski gear, and essentially become pedestrians, oftentimes walking in the roadway. So they're now vulnerable to other traffic. You combine that with they often park on or over the white line, which makes it difficult for the snowplows operationally to get through those narrowed spaces. But also at the end of the day, all these cars make a K-turn, right? They don't drive up to the end of the road to turn around. they kind of block traffic and do a K-turn, which severely affects mobility. So those are the three main reasons why the department is considering eliminating the roadside parking above entry 1. So the last component that would be part of all three primary alternatives are what we call travel demand management strategies. So like we talked about, our goal is to reduce the total number of vehicles in the canyon by 30%. And if we're going to do that, we need to incentivize the use of either the bus or gondola options. So that means some form of subsidized fares, similar to how the fares are subsidized today. And again, these reduced fares would be part of all three of the primary alternatives. The other side of this is we need to disincentivize the use of personal vehicles. And the two strategies that we're considering are vehicle occupancy restrictions, AKA no single occupant vehicles, and or tolling on SR 210 during busy winter periods. And the one thing I can't stress enough is the department has not decided on which of these strategies would be most effective. And of course, what a toll should be. So we've had a lot of questions about that, and that just hasn't been determined yet. And I really want to stress that. So some of the considerations that are part of these tolling and occupancy restrictions is potentially only tolling the upper canyon and not tolling the lower canyon. And the thought process there is we're providing a transit alternative to get up to the upper canyon. So you have a choice, and we want people to take that choice. So again, the lower canyon for whether it be backcountry skiers or hikers or climbers in the spring, potentially there would be no tolling for those users in the lower canyon. And the other option is implementing essentially a congestion-based pricing model. And this is similar to what you see on the HOV lanes on I-15 currently, that during busy periods, the tolls would go up, and during non-busy periods, they would go down. So in this situation, a Saturday of President's Day, when we have extremely high demand, the toll would be higher. And then on a random sunny Tuesday at 11 a.m. in March, potentially there's no toll. So those are some of the considerations. And I think those considerations are really important because one, if we're going to have a toll, we should provide an alternate mode for people to get up there. Because wilderness really is for everybody. And I think this is an important consideration. I know it's important to me, it's important to everybody on the team, in that we can't just reserve Little Cottonwood for those that can afford it. It's too valuable of a resource for everybody. And so that's why some of those considerations are in place. So schedule, we are currently in that light blue arrow in the middle there, the alternatives development and refinement. So you can see we are in that public meeting today, and we are roughly 15 days into a 35-day public comment period. I want to say thank you. To date, we've received just over 1,400 comments the last time I checked, which is fantastic. I can't, please submit official comments. That is the one thing that if you take from this presentation, we want to hear about what you agree with, what you didn't agree with, and what you feel we missed. Please comment. Next steps, we obviously take all those comments, review them, see how they all fit within these reasonable alternatives. We are looking at having a draft EIS released in the spring of 2021. And that draft EIS will have a public hearing associated with it and another 45-day public comment period. And then our goal is to have a final EIS and a record of decision, or ROD, at the end of 2021. So that's kind of a larger picture of the project's schedule. So again, that public comment period, it started on July 8th when we put all the documents on the website. I encourage you to go to the website. There's a wealth of information there. The complete screening report is there. We have summary fact sheets. There's just a ton of information there. Again, you can find the full-length version of this presentation there if you want additional details. But please comment. You can make a comment from the website. You can email us at our email address. You can call our project phone number. You can put a stamp at a letter. But please make that official public comment, because we need to hear what we did through one of those 4 formats, because those are the 4 official comment options. And with that, that's the end of my presentation. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dave and see what questions we've gotten in the comment box. So Dave.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks for walking through the presentation. As mentioned before, we will start to go through the questions that are in the chat. And we'll take them as far as we can go in the next hour and 15 minutes. It's 6:45, and this is scheduled to go until 8 o'clock. Again, just looking at the number of comments that we have, we will probably not, and questions, we'll probably not make it through all of them tonight. So we appreciate all the comments and questions we're receiving, but we will take the time to post those and this recording of this meeting with an FAQ. So with that, I'm going to turn off my video, Josh, and I'll begin with the questions.
Perfect. So I want to say one thing before we start, and that's I may turn some of these questions over to other members of the team that introduce themselves. Obviously, Lance represents the Forest Service and Autumn with UTA, but also potentially to Bree and Vince for help with some of the specialty questions to make sure we're answering appropriately. So I may turn some of these over to other members of the team and just want everybody to know that.
All right, let's get started. Josh, the first question comes from Matt Vroka. I don't know if I said your name correctly. If a gondola becomes the option of choice, what is the expected downtime per season due to wind and storms? And what, if any, is the backup plan to move people up the canyon in an efficient way when the gondola is down?
So that's a great question. I don't know that we have done a proper analysis for expected downtimes at this point. The one thing I will say is obviously gondolas are built for mountain transportation, right? So they're designed to work in this sort of environment. And a 3S gondola, I believe, is rated to be able to handle 68-mile-an-hour winds, which is much higher than we commonly get. Now, that being said, to your point, there probably will be occurrences when the gondola will be on wind hold. And in those situations, we will have to look at what some of those alternate plans are for getting people up and down the canyon. Because that may be a day where driving is just required because of wind holds. But that's a good thing to point out, and I appreciate you pointing that out.
All right, Josh, moving on. The next question comes from, don't have a name, just I love Little Cottonwood Canyon is the name. And
me too.
The question is, thank you for your hard work up to this point, but do you think this study was ready for review when you don't have the following information? And then a list of questions. What kind of impact will each choice have on the environment and watershed? There's a series of questions, so I'll stop in between each question.
Okay, good, because if there's a whole bunch of questions, I'm not going to remember any of them in the right order except for the last one. So the first one, that's the next phase. Those environmental, air quality, water quality impacts, that's what we're starting with and moving forward after the comment period, and will be released in the draft EIS. Obviously, we couldn't do that analysis for 105 separate alternates that were considered. So that work begins really after the comment period with our 3 alternatives. So you're right, that does need to be done, and that's the next phase of the NEPA process.
Okay, next question in this series of questions. How long will each choice take to construct?
So again, that's part of that further analysis. I will say that gondola construction is relatively fast and isn't as temperature dependent as roadway construction. But that's something that'll be further considered in that next phase. Again, these are all details, forthcoming analysis.
Okay, next question. Will lockers be available at the resort for people who take the bus or gondola?
That's a great question. And that's something that we've had some initial talks with both Snowbird and Alta. And we need to consider user experience on these modes of transit. So I can't say, all I can say is we've started the discussion. We intend to continue the discussion. But if there isn't amenities to make transit easy, then nobody will take it, right? It makes perfect sense. That being said, we recognize that transit isn't going to work for every user within the canyon, right? There's obviously people with personal mobility problems. There's people with, if you have 2 or 3 kids, young children, taking any of these transit alternatives may just not work for you. So our goal was never to get 100% of the people or 100% of the vehicles out of the canyon. It was just to reduce it by 30% so we can get smooth operation, that mobility on the roadway. But no, user experience is incredibly important. And that's what you're talking about, is those lockers and amenities at the resort landings. So they are being considered. We're talking about that with the resorts, but we don't have any final details at this point.
Okay, next one in this series of questions. What is the state's budget for Little Cottonwood Canyon improvement, and why wasn't a budget approved prior to these suggested solutions?
So as many of you are aware, Senate Bill 277 allocated for $100 million for recreation hotspots within Utah, and $66 million of that had been allocated to Little Cottonwood. Some of that money has been used for spot improvements. There's an auxiliary lane that's being constructed this summer. There's 3 additional high tees that are being constructed in the canyon. But the short answer is money hasn't been allocated because we don't know how much we need yet. And we can't ask for money from the legislature until we have a preferred alternative. Because as you saw, there was 3 pretty wide ranges. I don't want to say wide, but there's different amounts of capital costs and with each of the 3 reasonable alternatives. So until we decide which one makes the most sense, we can't ask for money. And then of course, we need the legislature to appropriate that money, which there's no guarantee that they will. I mean, of course, we hope they will and we think they will, but we can't guarantee that the money would be appropriated.
Okay, next question. Will people be charged for parking at the bus hubs?
So that is a great question. I feel like I've answered I don't know to all of I Love Little Cottonwood Canyon's questions. But the short answer is we haven't decided that either. If we need to make the transit alternatives as attractive as possible in lieu of driving your personal vehicle. And anytime that becomes more expensive or timely, that detracts from that attractiveness of the alternative. So while I can't say 100% no, we're absolutely trying to minimize the cost as much as we can. So that was a really long answer for that hasn't been decided yet. I'm sorry.
Okay, you may have the same answer for the next question. How much will the toll be during peak hours?
That is the same answer. We just haven't decided yet. And to be honest, it'll probably be based on demand and getting to that 30% goal. So it'll probably be dialed up and down based on demand, but for an actual dollar value, we haven't done the analysis and we just don't know yet. Again, forthcoming.
So the last question in this series of questions probably summarizes all of your answers. With so many unanswered questions, how do you expect to choose an appropriate solution?
So again, I feel like this is really speaks to the NEPA process and the process that's set up by the US DOT. So to kind of give a brief overview of the NEPA process, because Vince, you've been doing this for a long time. Can you give a little overview of that process?
Sure. So right now we are in the midst of alternative development and we're seeking comments on the 3 alternatives that we've screened and determined to be reasonable alternatives. And now we're asking the public, did we miss something? Is there something else we should be looking at? Is there some adjustments to these alternatives that we should be considering before we go into the next phase, which is once we determine what those reasonable alternatives are and we make any adjustments that the public, we think that the public thinks should be made, then we'll start doing the environmental analysis on those alternatives that meet the purpose and need. And then from that point, we will release a draft EIS for public comment, and hopefully people will review the document and give us comments on our analysis and bring up anything that they feel we've missed. At that time, we'll also release a preferred alternative, what UDOT thinks the one that they would like to move forward with. And then after that comment period's over, we'll get into preparing the final EIS, which will mean we'll respond to each individual comment that was provided. And at the end of us making adjustments to the final EIS based on those comments, UDOT will review all the information in the administrative record, including the analysis, comments received, and make a decision on what they feel is the best transportation solution, considering all the factors, which include impacts to the environment, what provides the greatest benefit to the traveling public, cost. And so they'll make that decision and submit that in a record of decision, which will then, once they make that, allow them to move forward with construction.
Okay, thank you, Josh and Vince. Let's move to the next question. This comes from Sean M. The EIS understates the capabilities of a modern gondola system, especially regarding maximum speed, which would result in reduced travel time. Does UDOT plan to update the gondola stats? And how will those updates be communicated to the public?
So again, the speeds we got from equipment manufacturers. So that's based on that 17, 18 mile per hour speed. The travel time is based on that. And again, that's what we got from 2 separate gondola manufacturers. Now the capacity question, you're right, we are underutilizing the capacity of the gondola, but our goal was to get the 30% usage. And that 30% usage results in roughly 1,000 passengers in the peak hour, which you're right, is lower than the total capacity of a gondola. But again, our goal wasn't to get all of the cars out of the canyon. Our goal was to get 30% of the cars out of the canyon so that the roadway mobility becomes stable.
Okay, Josh, next question. Well, at the end of that, that's how will updates be communicated to the public? I mean, any updates will be communicated via the website and project email updates, so people can sign up for project email updates as well. Anything else you want to add to that?
No, it's just if any of the comments we receive result in us having to amend the screening report, we'll obviously, like Dave said, we'll amend the screening report and we'll let everybody know that an updated version has been released after the comment period.
Okay, thanks, Josh. Next question from Marvin L. And you answered this in the presentation, but if you want to just quickly cover it again, how long is the actual gondola ride time?
So the total travel time is 53 minutes, but that's not the actual travel time. And I'm gonna have to phone a friend because I don't have that document in front of me, and nor do I have a computer screen that I can look something else up on. So that's on the alternative fact sheet. But again, I don't have that in front of me. So Bree or Vince, do you have one of those that you could help out with? Look that up, because yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. Maybe we should go to the next question, and while those guys are, one of those guys is looking up the actual gondola seat time, and we can come back to it in a minute.
Okay, sounds good. Next question is from I Love Little Cottonwood Canyon. Did you consider the technological advancements in automobiles and buses in 30 years? Won't gondolas be rickety relics in 2050?
Vince, you explained this really well the other day. I hope you're not in the middle of looking up the actual gondola seat time. Can you help with this question?
Well, I was looking up the speed time, and just the gondola itself from the mouth of Little Cottonwood Canyon to Snowbird is 24 minutes, and to Alta it is 34 minutes. And then can you repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry, Vince.
Yes, I can
didn't
repeat
mean
it.
to do that to you.
Did you consider the technological advancements in automobiles and buses in 30 years? Won't gondolas be relics by 2050?
Well, right now we can only go with the technology that we know that exist, and I know there's a lot of autonomous vehicles out there, and there's other things that people are considering, but right now the technology isn't to the point where it would work for Little Cottonwood Canyon. Now, out 10 years, maybe the technology will be changed and we'll be ready for that, but it's hard for us to predict the future since we don't know what that technology is, and it keeps evolving. And so we need to go with what we can implement when the record of decision is complete and at the end of next year. And that's what technology exists today.
Okay, next question is from Marvin L. Any thoughts on having a gondola from Little Cottonwood Canyon to Big Cottonwood Canyon?
So that's a question we've gotten a couple of times. There's actually, and I forget what appendix it is as part of the screening report, but there's an entire section dedicated to not just a gondola from the top of Little Cottonwood to Park City, but also the option of running express buses. They did some traffic studies and figured out how many people were driving around the mountain using the Bluetooth sensors in the roadway. So you can see vehicle paths and percentages of traffic. And honestly, on the very best day, we only got just above 8%. 8% of the total traffic going into Little Cottonwood went over Summit Park or went over Parley's Pass. So we're not just collecting Park City traffic, we are collecting the people going from Jeremy and Pine Brook and Kimball. So that's kind of the highest possible use is gas alternate communities. And like I mentioned, to get the mobility goal, we need a 30% reduction. And that only represented 8% of the traffic. So honestly, it doesn't solve the purpose that we're trying to solve. So it was considered. If you want far more detail than I just summarized, it is covered in one of the appendices. So please look that up. Because yeah, it has all the details you can need.
All right, next question, Josh. This comes from Aaron Evans. What is the physical footprint of a snow shed? How much concrete will it take to build through 3,100 feet of snow sheds, and how long will they take to build?
So again, the how long will it take to build question hasn't been answered. Vince, do you know the cross-sectional area of the walls and the roof of the snow shed? I've never done the math, to be honest. Do we even have the design to that far at this point on the snow sheds? I mean, obviously snow sheds are possible. They're used all over the world, right?
Yeah,
so
and I don't have that information off the top of my head. There is one of the appendices that's online to the report is the snow shed report, and in the back of that there's a cost estimate and how they were developed. I believe that includes the quantities that would be needed to build the snow sheds, that cost estimate. So it's in there. I just don't know it off the top of my head.
10-4. And remember, the total length of the snow shed, the first option with berms is roughly 2,500 feet long. And the second option of snow shed without berms is 3,200 feet long. So, I mean, we're talking half-mile plus long snow shed here. So it's a fair amount of concrete.
We are putting in the chat for a couple of these questions, links to where those specific reports are that contain that information on both travel times and snow sheds. So look in your chat for links to those specific reports. Next question comes from Chris McCandless. A private article states that the carbon dioxide emissions generated from transportation up Little Cottonwood Canyon are significantly reduced by 56% using the gondola as compared to 3,500 cars per day traveling in the canyon. Does UDOT intend to verify this information or provide its own comparison of the emission air quality impacts between the primary transportation options?
And that would be part of that further air quality analysis that we're looking at of comparing the three alternatives. So we will be looking at what the air quality impacts of the three alternatives are.
Okay, next question. Could UDOT tell the public, well, this comes from Norm. Could UDOT tell the public how the 30% reduction in cars threshold for alternatives came to be?
Sure. So like I mentioned earlier, a 2-lane mountainous road is generally assumed to be able to support 1,000, maybe 1,100 vehicles per hour at peak. At which point, once you get above that capacity threshold, the throughput of that roadway falls off dramatically and quickly. So our goal was to keep that roadway capacity below that threshold in the 2050 planning horizon. So we assumed growth projections based on historical growth projections and extrapolated that out into our 2050 planning year. And that 30-year planning horizon is pretty standard for transportation projects, because the last thing you want to do is build a project that only solves today's problems, because tomorrow your project is your brand new project is going to be outdated again and will be on the brink of failure. So again, it's pretty common to design projects for 30-year projected travel growth. And then when you use that 1,000 vehicles per hour as the capacity threshold, really we were trying to get that delta between the capacity threshold and the projected growth into transit. Vince, is there anything that I missed in that description or needs clarifying?
No, that's pretty good. I mean, with all the alternatives, we just hover right around that capacity. That's why our travel time isn't completely free flow going up the canyon for vehicles. It's still a little bit congested, but it's reduced enough at 30% that the vehicles move okay, and then the people will also that are in transit can also move, you know, if they're in buses as well.
All right, next question from I Love Little Cottonwood Canyon, a frequent questioner. EIS stands for Environmental Impact Studies. So why were limited studies done on the environmental impact that construction and utilization of each of these proposed choices would have on the canyon and watershed? And I believe you answered that on her previous question, that that's still coming.
Right, that's the next phase of the NEPA process. So, yep.
So her second part of that question is, why was environmental protection not part of our purpose statement?
So Vince, can you help with that answer?
Sure. Our goal is to solve a transportation problem, and therefore our purpose is focused on that. As far as environmental protection goes, that is part of the environmental analysis that we do once we come up with the alternatives. If we said that our goal was to protect the environment, then we would not come up with any transportation solution. So we come up with the transportation solutions, then we look at the environmental impacts of those solutions, and then we look at ways to mitigate those impacts to the environment.
Okay, thank you, Vince. Next question comes from Chris McCandless. It was stated in last night's meeting that the gondola would need 20 towers. In a conversation with Doppelmayr, they stated that the 3S gondola can have spans of up to 9,000 feet. Using some rudimentary math, this equates to 12 to 13 towers. Does UDOT have a map showing where they feel the towers would be located? And will one be made available prior to making the decision so we can review those locations?
So I know the alignment map is on the website. I don't know if towers are on that map, to be completely honest.
Josh, the towers are also included on the web map that was put on the website the other night. And to answer the question, it's not a simple math calculation of every 9,000 feet there's a tower. You have to take into account where the avalanche paths are, because you don't want to locate it in one of the strongest avalanche paths. So you have to kind of move the towers around. You have to look at the topography where it makes sense to put the towers. And also, if you space the towers at their maximum at 9,000 feet, you get what is called slack. So the line drops in between the two towers. And we also did a hard look. We hired some experts, not only in gondola design, but in avalanches. And in Little Cottonwood, there's what they call a powder blast. That powder blast could go up to 200 feet. So if you space the towers 9,000 feet apart, and that line drops down to 100 feet, let's say, above the canyon floor, it would be in the powder blast of the avalanche. So we had to add more towers to keep the gondolas above the powder blast.
And then the second half of that question was, will there be, we do have a map showing where they are. So that answered that second question. Okay. Next question, it comes from S. Pruitt, and I think I can answer this one, Josh. It says, is this being recorded for viewing later? And the answer is yes. This is being recorded and will be on the website. Next question from Leslie Hugo, and I believe you answer this during your presentation, Josh, but if you want to clarify, curious if gondolas will be running year round as traffic during the summer wildflower hiking season has become challenging.
So again, we're asking for comment on that. I agree that there are some busier times in the summer months, but they haven't reached those, or are they projected to reach those threshold values similar to the winter transportation problem. So there's currently not a need for summer gondola service. And the main part of that is it just, summer season does not see that same peak flow surrounding the starting and stopping of the ski lifts. There's the people that go hiking at 6 in the morning to beat the heat. And then there's the people that go out to breakfast and just want to go for a walk. And then you have the people that want to barbecue in the evening. So the peak flow is much more balanced in the summer than it is in winter. So we just, and that's the main reason there's not a need, is because the balance of people entering and leaving the canyon at any given time. But we are asking for comments on summer gondola service explicitly, please. Like I said, it isn't currently planned to be analyzed as part of the EIS, but we recognize the gondola may have specific tourism value. So if you're, again, would like to see it, please comment on it. If you would like not to see summer gondola service, please comment on that too. And include any restrictions you think are appropriate on summer usage. We'd be interested in hearing that too.
All right, next question, Josh, from Colby Rollins. Gondola provides a second egress out of the canyon. Will a UDOT study consider the health and safety benefits of a second egress?
So it doesn't necessarily provide a second egress in all situations. Yes, there are certain situations that it may be beneficial, but it's so limited. So in the situation of a mudslide, depending on where that mudslide is, it might. If there was an earthquake situation, it's unlikely that we would allow anybody to board the gondola without structural inspection, right? Of course. And the same thing with wildfires. If there was wildfires, but again, the real answer is analyzing secondary egress was not part of the purpose of the project. So we will not be analyzing that as part of the EIS.
Okay, next question comes from Marvin Lorica. Couldn't road widening with a reversible lane during peak hours allow for additional bus transit?
So again, somebody can help me with a link to the appendix that addresses reversible lanes in the reports. But I'll give you the quick 1-minute tour of that appendix. And we did look at that, and we looked at 2 different options of reversible lanes. So the first option involves the utilization of precast concrete barrier, and they essentially use a giant machine to push it left or right 12 feet in the morning and in the afternoon commute. And Utah has actually used this a number of times in construction projects. And the real downfall with that is the mover machine, in that concrete barrier is obviously very heavy. And the second part of that is it requires the machine, and traffic is slowed not only during that move, but honestly, the bigger thing is that any avalanche that hits the road is going to displace that barrier and push it likely into the uphill lane, blocking that lane. So we really thought the concrete barrier, that was the severe limitation for the concrete barrier. The second option that was reviewed was an overhead gantry system, similar to 54 South. I believe it goes from, oh gosh, Redwood to maybe 27th West in Taylorsville. So in the overhead gantry system, you essentially have a green check mark or a green circle or a red X denoting whether a lane is open or closed. And the main reason that was eliminated was the visual impacts. Design standards say that you should be able to see 2 signs ahead. This would have resulted in approximately 64, I believe, overhead gantries in the canyon. And again, because of the fact it's a scenic byway, those impacts were considered, is why it wasn't considered, was the visual impacts associated with it. So those are the cliff notes to read why the 2 reversible lanes were eliminated.
All right, next question, Josh, comes from Tony. Will you not update the stats in the EIS on the 3S gondola system? That's a repeat question from previous. And where did these travel times come from, since they don't reflect the latest technology available? I think you answered both of those previously. But if you want to reiterate, they came from the gondola.
Again, we got gondola speeds from 2 prominent manufacturers. So that's the best thing that we have. If you have some information that we should look at, but again, we went to 2 prominent manufacturers and they said that's what the max travel or max speed is. But we're more than willing to hear if there's a different source that you can share with us.
All right, next question comes from I love Little Cottonwood Canyon. I read in the Mountain Accord study that the average car driving up the canyon contained 1.6 people. So why don't you try charging a toll during peak hours to encourage carpooling before taking the more dramatic and costly measure of building a gondola or road widening?
And again, I think part of that is we need to give an alternative that people can take in lieu of just charging a toll. So you can't, just the justice part of that is somewhat troubling, to essentially only limit the canyon to those people that can afford the canyon. There needs to be a viable alternative for people that can't afford the toll.
Okay, next question, Josh, comes from Brittany. In comparing the 2 primary options, more buses versus the gondola, has UDOT completed a noise pollution comparison study? And if not, will they do one as part of the EIS?
We will do one as part of the EIS, and that's part of that bigger picture environmental impacts that we're going to do now that in this next phase. So haven't done it yet, and that's part of the next phase.
Okay, next question comes from Mara Carabello. Can we see alternative sites for the gondola that would include enough parking and is not at the mouth of the canyon?
So if you read the aerial transit appendix, you can see that UDOT did look at quite a few different locations and options of the gondola. The main reason that we selected the one we did has to do with the number of cars that currently congest Wasatch, North Little Cottonwood Road, and many of the surrounding neighborhood streets. So getting a majority of those cars out from that alignment was the main reason that the bus to the gondola alternative was selected. Again, it's that mobility on Wasatch and 2,500 cars literally clogging up Wasatch and the surrounding neighborhood. So is that impact, that's the main reason why it was placed where it was.
Okay, next question comes from Aaron Evans. Will UDOT provide the zone of destruction / environmental impact maps for each option? The gondola and the larger road, avalanche bunkers or sheds, impact map for the public to review prior to a final decision. So will we show the zone of environmental impact for those options.
So if I'm Vince, jump in here, but I'm reading that as, will we be showing the cut fill lines, right? Because, and obviously there's some construction tolerances around those too. Are those included at the draft EIS?
They will be included in the draft EIS. And I know online we have, for example, the maps for Wasatch Boulevard. We have the tower locations for the Gondola, and we have a couple others, and those do show the footprints right now if someone is interested in just going in and taking a look at those.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. Next question comes from I Love Little Cottonwood Canyon. Who says, I love the idea of finding a solution to the avalanche prone areas, but why are you spending millions of dollars on a weekend and holiday traffic problem that the ski resorts create instead of establishing laws that limit the amount of people at the resorts themselves? And the second part of the second question relates to the first. Private institutions are all subject to capacity limitations to protect the safety of its patrons. So why was that not taken into consideration when safety is the third objective on your purpose statement?
So the first thing I would say is it's not within UDOT's purview nor ability to limit capacity at the resort. So that's why it wasn't considered, because that's not something that we can control, in all honesty. So, and what was the second question? I just want to make sure I answer the right question versus what I think the question is.
The question was, private institutions are all subject to capacity limitations to protect the safety of its patrons. So why was that not taken into consideration when safety is the third objective on your purpose statement?
Okay, and I think that really goes back to my first answer, in that that's not within UDOT's ability to control, and therefore it's outside the scope of the EIS.
Okay, we're getting some questions in the chat about, we haven't asked your question yet. Just to remind you, when we started this meeting, we said we would start asking the questions from the beginning of the chat and make through as many as we could until we got to the end of our meeting time. If we don't get to your questions, we will publish those questions and the answers on the website. So just a reminder that we're going in the order in which we received the questions in the chat as the most fair way to do it. So if we don't get to your questions, they will be answered and put on the website, just to clarify from some comments that I've seen on the chat line. So next question comes from Colby Rollins. As any change to transportation will have an impact on wildlife, will UDOT compare the impact on wildlife, for example, noise pollution, larger road system, concrete sheds, auto accidents, for each transportation solution?
That is a great question. I think we had a similar question last night, Vince, that you had a fantastic answer to. So can you help with that?
Sure. So yes, this last summer, we were out doing all the field surveys, first identifying what are the resources that are in the potential areas of construction impact, and those off a distance for potential indirect impact. So we surveyed for wetlands and wildlife and plant species and wildlife species that may be along the corridor. We also worked with the Forest Service, who helped us with their experience in the canyon and what resources are there. Once we get to start doing the analysis, we will be evaluating the impacts to the natural environment in the canyon from each of those alternatives, so that the decision makers can weigh the different adverse impacts and the benefits of the alternatives.
All right, thank you. Next question comes from Sheila White. A gondola system completely ignores all non-resort skiing users of Little Cottonwood Canyon. how does a multi-million-dollar capital charge with tens of millions in annual operating costs make it onto the solutions list for the sole benefit of two private for-profit businesses? Isn't this just plain and simple a socialization of costs while privatizing profits for Alta and Snowbird?
So I would disagree with that comment, and really all Canyon users benefit from more reliable transportation and better mobility. So if you're just going up for a picnic, or I guess backcountry skiing would be a better example. If you're just going up as a backcountry skier, you are caught in exactly the same traffic as the people that are going to either of the resorts. And this includes people that are just going up for a drive. Because remember, not all of this happens on bad weather days. Some days there's literally just so many skiers going up that the canyon becomes clogged because it's over capacity. So I can see where you're coming from there, but I guess I would disagree in that we're trying to solve the mobility and reliability problem for all users of the canyon. And that represents backcountry skiers, climbers, hikers, people that want to go for a drive.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Next question comes from Claiborne Elder. People might prefer to ride a gondola than take a bus up the canyon. Is there a planned survey to see how many more people might want to ride the gondola and what that would mean financially? Will UDOT plan to ask Salt Lake County residents if they would use it and if they think it will prevent accidents, and how many tax dollars should go toward the project?
So again, Vince, jump in here, but my understanding is there is not a plan to ask, right? I mean, again, the NEPA process is not a popularity contest. We're trying to take a very rigorous factual look at what the environmental impacts are, and not, again, voting for what option they would like to see. Again, it's a very rigorous process for a reason. So what did I miss there, Vince?
No, I think you hit it. It's not a vote. It's taking a look at all the information, all the environmental analysis that was done, weighing the impacts and the benefits of each solution to make an informed decision.
I mean, and there are additional benefits that aren't considered. They do exist. I mean, I mentioned the advantage to cyclists and pedestrians in the widening option. Again, it's not part of the goal. It's not part of the preferred alternative decision-making process, but different alternatives do have additional benefits. But again, that's not part of the decision-making process because it's not supporting the purpose or the need of the project. I hope that makes more sense.
Okay, next question comes from, I love Little Cottonwood Canyon. If they don't allow dogs up the canyon due to sensitivity and protection of our watershed, why should they allow construction of a 4-lane road that will come uncomfortably close to Little Cottonwood Stream?
And again, that's what we're going to analyze in this next phase. What are the impacts of both, or of all the alternatives, both their operation and the construction of each alternative, and compare them relative to see what those impacts are.
The next question you might have the same answer to. Wouldn't the gondola option have a much smaller environmental impact than road widening, diesel-powered buses, and snowshoes?
To be determined. Again, that's what we're looking at in the next phase.
Okay, next question. Oh, sorry. Next question comes from Sheila White. What percentage of the capital costs have Snowbird and Alta agreed to assume, given that industry consolidation plummeting per day cost of annual passes has created the traffic problems in Little Cottonwood and Big Cottonwood Canyons?
And again, we expect the capital costs to come through the legislature and hope that they come through the legislature. So they would come from the state of Utah.
Next question comes from Norm. Isn't the gondola or road improvements alternatives, the third lane, actually part of the mountain transportation system being worked on by the Central Wasatch Commission? How can Central Wasatch effectively work on such a system before it knows what the UDOT preferred alternative is?
So I think it's important to know where the Little Cottonwood EIS versus the work that the CWC is doing are similar, but they're different. Like I showed in that very second slide, we are laser focused on Little Cottonwood Canyon and the effects of Little Cottonwood Canyon, where the CWC is looking at a much larger area, including Big Cottonwood, Parley's, and the Wasatch Back. So geographically, our scopes aren't the same. The other part of that is time-wise, they're on a much faster time frame. And part of that is because they're a planning study versus an EIS, while they're doing a thorough job, they aren't subject to the NEPA process and doing that really detailed analysis of what are the air quality effects of buses versus a gondola. So because of the detailed requirements of the NEPA process, our overall process is slower. And again, we talked about, our EIS, which is planned for spring of next year. Our process is just moving slower than theirs is. So, but you're right, they do overlap in area with regard to Little Cottonwood Canyon a little bit, but we're doing that detailed evaluation where they're really looking at a regional transportation system. So I just want to highlight those differences between the two efforts.
Next question, Josh, I've heard you state that you have no jurisdiction over the ski resorts ticket sales. So who does have jurisdiction over the ski resorts? Who can establish a law that would restrict the number of people on the mountain? And then there's a third part of that. Wouldn't the toll station provide an easy way to limit the number of people allowed up the canyon?
So the ski resorts operate under a special use permit. And I will turn that over to Lance, who's the acting acting district ranger, to provide a much better answer than I could hope to give on how that all works.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. So I can't answer the question directly, and I'll explain that in my answer. But as far as jurisdiction, the Forest Service doesn't have jurisdiction directly over the ski areas, but rather we have jurisdiction over the National Forest System lands within the permitted ski area boundaries. With that said, under the authorities that the USDA Forest Service has, and these come down through the National Ski Area Permit Act and the Ski Area Recreational Opportunity Enhancement Act, through our authorities under those, the Forest Service has the ability to determine what acreage is necessary. And again, I'm just speaking of National Forest System lands, but the acreage that is necessary for the ski areas to appropriately operate their businesses. However, with regards to capacity, the management of capacity within the permitted ski area boundary on National Forest System lands, as well as visitor experience and safety, is basically remains the responsibility of each respective ski area. And that's falls under explicit statements in their ski area permits from the Forest Service. And I believe, did I miss part of that question, Dave?
The last part was, wouldn't a toll station provide an easy way to limit the number of people up the canyon? But you addressed the jurisdiction.
I'll take the second part, Lance. Thanks for
Thank you, Josh.
covering the first part, because that's clearly more your wheelhouse than mine, and I didn't want to say something incorrectly. So thank you.
You're welcome.
So I think the second part of the question about a tolling station, in reality, a tolling station at the bottom of the canyon it needs to be something a little more complex than that, right? Think of the red snake that we've all experienced coming down the canyon. And then think of the Mill Creek toll booth and how long you've waited at the Mill Creek toll booth. I personally have been stuck at the Rattlesnake Gulch trailhead on, a Saturday morning, literally having difficulties getting out of the parking lot. And obviously the capacity of Mill Creek is much lower than Little Cottonwood. So it would have to be a more high-tech system than that, most likely a combination of license plate readers and Easy Pass system. But I want to reinforce the point that we shouldn't do tolling unless we're giving a viable option for people to get up the canyon. Because again, we can't reserve wilderness and the special place that Little Cottonwood is exclusively for people who have enough money to pay the toll. And that's really important to me. And again, it's really important to the project team and it's really important to UDOT. So tolling on its own I just can't support that idea without providing an alternate solution to get people up there efficiently and safely. We can't just reserve it for rich people.
Next question, Josh, from Claiborne Elder. What do we do about the 61 avalanche paths that aren't addressed by snow sheds?
That's a good question. You're absolutely right. There are many more avalanche paths, and you combine there's subparts of many of those other paths. The one thing I would say is the project team worked really closely with UDOT's avalanche crew. And these are the 3 most frequent repeaters in the canyon. These are the ones that are shot the most. And they're also the ones that most frequently hit the road. So these are the 3 paths that, again, are the significant hazard in the canyon. But you're absolutely right. There are many other paths in the canyon that are still a concern. But the thought process is take care of the biggest and most frequent problems in the canyon. Above the canyon, obviously, they have the bypass road, which is there. But again, frequent repeaters, take care of the biggest problems.
Okay, next question comes from Kyle. Will you clarify if the gondola requires 2 mobility hubs?
So the gondola is currently shown with only a single mobility hub. And the main reason behind that is to reduce the overall cost of the system. Because a second mobility hub requires more buses to circulate, to load the gondola. If that's something that you feel like we should consider farther, I would encourage you to absolutely make a comment regarding your view on that. So again, that's why we did it. Honestly, it was trying to minimize the overall cost. And we did that with all the options, right? Is trying to figure out the most efficient way to build them. If that's something you feel that we got wrong, please comment.
All right, next question comes from Aaron Evans. In comparing the 2 options, will UDOT take into consideration the rate of vehicle accidents in Little Cottonwood during all times of the year, and then project how many accidents and injuries would be decreased if UDOT selects the gondola? Is not one of the primary criteria to provide safer access to the canyon. Will this information be included in the EIS? And there's 3 options we should clarify, but yes.
Right. Vince, can you help with this answer for the technical analysis part?
Sure. You got to remember, whether it be the gondola or the buses, the goal is to reduce vehicle use in the canyons by the same amount, which is 30%. So from that perspective, there'd be the same amount of vehicles in the canyon excluding the additional buses, but basically the same amount of vehicles in the canyon, whether it be the gondola or the bus alternative. So the accident rate would be similar.
All right, next question. Your purpose statement says that you'll preserve the value of the Wasatch Mountains. What do you mean by value? Are you contributing value to income the ski resorts bring to the state, to the protections of Utah's water source, or to the recreational opportunities beyond skiing enjoyed by visitors? If you believe all three are of value, why is transportation to their ski resorts your primary objective?
And again, that's a hard question to answer, right? The environmental impacts for all of them will be analyzed and compared relative to each other to see which one is the best balance between mobility, reliability, and safety, but also impacts and cost. And this is a balancing act between those components and so many other components. And I think you brought out 3 different values that different user groups rate differently relative to each other. And that's why we're asking for public comment at this period, is to see what, again, options you feel as the public that we did right or did not do right, and to try and find that optimal balance between all of those competing efforts.
All right, next question comes from Brittany. How long would it take to build a 3rd lane in Little Cottonwood Canyon? And how many cement trucks and trips would it require up and down the canyon? This is a question about construction impacts.
Again, we haven't done that level of analysis yet for timeframes to complete. There's some rough quantity estimates in the screening report, but I don't have that in front of me. So, and then much of that comes to construction means and methods, right? So what type of trucks they would use. So it's, you honestly can't say right now, but yeah, more than likely, Vince, correct me if I'm wrong, but the estimates were actually for an asphalt road rather than a concrete road, correct? Or do you remember off the top of your head?
It's asphalt, it's not concrete.
Yeah, that's kind of what I assumed. So the good thing is, again, we can go look at the report and backtrack that into some number of trips, but the vehicle size isn't determined by the department, that's determined by the contractor. So we just don't know.
Okay, the next 2 questions are related. One comes from Matt Sybil and one comes from Erica. And the question is, why were trains or the rail alternative eliminated as a reasonable alternative? They don't meet their own alignment like the engineers say it does. The impacts of the national environment are the same as the roadway alternatives, and it's running on clean power. Please explain why they were eliminated. So those 2 questions are the same question.
So the one thing I'm going to disagree with is the impacts to the natural and built environment were not the same in our analysis. It did make it to level 2 screening. So the cod rail option did meet the purpose and need, but when you compare it to the other 3 options, we estimated that there was going to be approximately 54 F impacts and 50 home relocations required under that alternative. Comparatively, the enhanced bus or the gondola have 9 4F impacts. So significantly higher impacts to the natural and built environment. And then you add on 50 plus additional home relocations that are required. And on top of that, the cost that we estimated was $1.7 billion. So 3 to 6 times higher than all of the other alternatives. So that's why it was screened out at the level 2 phasing, primarily for
I wanna-
impacts. Go ahead, Vince.
I want to add to that a little bit too. We did put the rail alignment in the existing roadway on 9400 South. And as people can imagine, just like downtown, if you have 2 tracks side by side, which we determine is necessary given the capacity that we're trying to reach, the road needs to be widened because there's just not the space there. So that's where you get the 50 home relocations along 9400 South. In the canyon, we obviously can't widen to the creek side because, as we know, the creek is right along the road in many places. So the only place to put the 2 tracks was adjacent to the road on the hillside. And so when you take 2 double tracks, that does require a lot more space because you do need to leave the road into place. And so you're building into the mountain, and given such a steep mountain, you have extreme cuts. And when you do that, it basically impacts those trailheads that are right there on that side of the road, which is the Gate Buttress, Britt Mill, and Lisa Falls trailhead. So that's another reason why those impacts were so much greater with the rail alternative.
Okay, thank you. Next question comes from Sheila White. How many electric or non-polluting buses could be purchased for $400 million?
So that's a good question. Currently, electric buses, we price this with the existing ski buses that they use. And the reason is that electric buses just don't do well in mountainous terrain and additionally in cold environments. So the current electric bus technology does not allow for electric buses to be used as part of these 24 bus round trips. So our estimates were based around the existing bus, because again, the electric bus technology just hasn't gotten there yet. I hope that answers the question you were asking.
Okay, next question. And I think you answered this in the presentation. Where is everyone going to park and or leave their cars for a gondola system? And that will be at the mobility hub.
Yep, so there's 2,500 stalls planned for the mobility hub. And just for reference, my understanding is that's the same size as the new parking garage at the airport. So it's a lot of cars that we're making space for.
Okay, next set of questions comes from Zen Meyer. Have climbers been considered at all with these plans?
Yes, obviously there is a very active and robust climbing community in Little Cottonwood. I mean, Little Cottonwood's a world-class climbing facility, of course, right? We have 2 of the largest climbing companies in Petzl and Black Diamond right here in Salt Lake. And I'm sure part of that is because of their proximity to Little Cottonwood. So I've had the opportunity to talk with different members of the climbing community, as has the team, to talk about both trail access and what resources might be potentially impacted. So no, we absolutely have not forgotten the climbing community, and we recognize how strong and how robust the climbing community is in the canyon.
Next part of that question, why does roadside parking need to be eliminated? How many, and these are related, how many accidents are currently caused by people crossing the street? Could these be eliminated by lowering the speeds that people drive the canyon?
So I do not have the exact number of how many accidents have occurred in front of me, but we all know that, and it's not, there's pedestrians, it's also having cyclists that need to go around these parked cars. And it's also side friction with cars passing. But I mean, it is a significant safety hazard. So I feel like I didn't answer that question very well. Vince, what did I miss?
No, I think you hit it pretty well. I mean, we do have the accident data in the purpose and need, and I don't have it in front of me. It's online, but there are some cyclist accidents that have occurred in the canyon. I don't remember if there's been pedestrian accidents, but one is too many, and there is an issue. I mean, I bike the canyon as well, and it's you know, when you go around cars in the travel lanes, and those are things, safety concerns that we think just needed to be addressed.
The last part of that question, why does Wasatch Boulevard need to be widened? The only time I've had issues with it is on powder days.
So remember, we're really looking at that 2050 planning horizon. So using that projected growth and designing for the needs in the future. Because again, if we design for the needs of today, then the project would be outdated as soon as we realized any growth. So again, it's that 30-year design horizon. And there is backing in the PM commute. Not every day, but again, there's expected to be a 45% growth in traffic along that roadway in the next 30 years, which will take it to level of service F.
Okay, next question comes from Matt Roca. Would the Alta buses stop at Wildcat, Collins, and Albion, or would there be an Albion bus and a Wildcat/Collins bus?
And again, Vince, jump in if, but the understanding thus far is that there would be a single stop at each resort, and where that stop is hasn't been necessarily decided yet. There's been talks about preferred alternatives, but I don't know that we've gotten that far into figuring out all the logistics around that.
Yeah, we are working with the ski resorts on that because they're the ones that need to receive the passengers from the bus and need to provide the amenities for those passengers. So they need to really say, you know, the best place at their resort for that bus to come in, drop people off, and get out of their parking lots quickly, and give us that information.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple questions related to, we've had a couple questions related to trains. These are repeat questions. So just wanted to let everyone know that we put the CogRail report in the link. So there's a direct link to that where you can find that. But one of those questions from Eric asked, why is a gondola a reasonable alternative? So why is it reasonable?
And that is honestly because it meets the purpose and the need of the project, and it's feasible. So those are the three main things, but it's also comparable to the other grouping of reasonable alternatives. So again, there's not only that level 1 screening of meeting the purpose and need, but it has to be relatively comparable to the other bus options. And as you saw, the gondola was in the middle of the two other capital cost-wise, travel time-wise, or sorry, capital cost-wise, it was lowest on the O&M costs, a little bit higher on travel time, and similar in 4F impacts and home relations. So when compared to the other two, that's what level 2 screening does, is really compares against the other alternatives. Because if it gets to that same place, but it has significantly more impacts, then it's not considered a reasonable alternative. And I should really defer all NEPA definitions to Vince in the future, but Vince, did I say that correctly, or did I miss something important there?
Yeah, that was good. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Josh. The time is 7:59, so we have 1 minute. So let me just, as we close, remind people of a few things in the link. And if I could ask Bree to put these links in again at the bottom of the chat, since they were done earlier. Just a reminder to click on the Google Doc link for your attendance sign in. Since we will be required to track attendance at public meetings, we'd really appreciate if you would sign in on that Google Doc. Another reminder that this recording will be on the website as soon as it's ready for those who would like to listen and watch this again. And just a reminder, everything we've talked about tonight, everything we've presented tonight is also on the website for additional analysis and review. And then we would remind you to please submit formal comments through the website, through email, through voicemail, and through letter if you prefer. And all of those methods and formal comment options are listed on the website, which was just included in the chat. Just a reminder, we did not get to all the questions tonight. We tried to follow a process of, as we stated at the beginning of this meeting, to go through questions in the order in which they were received, which we did. We made it through as many of those questions as we could in the time that was allocated for this meeting tonight. We held an identical meeting last night and tonight. So if your question didn't get answered, please go to the website for a full accounting of all the questions that were asked. And a reminder that the comment period runs through July 10th. And we ask all of you for whatever questions or comments that you've had tonight that we either got to or didn't, please submit those through the methods that I just mentioned. We appreciate your attendance tonight. We understand that these were virtual public meetings, and normally we would have been in person, but due to COVID-19 and that abundance of caution, we tried to put together the best alternative possible. So if you didn't get your question answered tonight because you were used to having a chance to come to a meeting and talk to somebody, or we try to accommodate to the best possible in the current state of environment with the precautions that we have been given by our health and government leaders. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Josh, for just a final thank you.
Thanks, Dave. And thank you to everybody for taking time out of your busy day today to spend some of it with us. And hopefully you've gained a better understanding of the alternatives and the components. And again, I'll say one more time, please provide official comment. It's these comments that support the decision-making process. So please use one of that methods and submit an official comment. And I hope this was worthwhile for everybody, and thank you for your time. Have a great day. Stay safe.